Welcome back to the channel. Today, we are shifting our focus. We have survived the crushing pressure of the deep ocean and the freezing isolation of the Arctic ice. But today's story brings us back to American soil. It is a story that every child learns in history class, but few understand the true, minute-by-minute psychological toll of the 87 people who lived it. It is a story about the thin line between civilization and savagery. It is about how quickly the rules of the world, the rules of morality, of family, and of humanity can evaporate when the hunger sets in. We are building a global community here of people who appreciate dark, atmospheric storytelling. I am always fascinated to see where you are all listening from, whether you're working the night shift, studying in a library, or just relaxing in the dark at home. So, before we cross the Sierra Nevada, do me a favor. Scroll down and leave a comment. Let me know what city or country you are watching. From right now, I read every single one, and it helps me understand who is out there in the dark with us. As always, if you appreciate these long-form deep dives, please leave a like on the video. It helps the signal cut through the noise. Now, put on your headphones, turn off the lights. Let's go to 1846. Chapter 1, The Golden Dream. To understand the horror of the end, we have to understand the beauty of the beginning. When we think of the Donner Party, we think of the snow. We think of the starvation. We think of the cabins buried deep under the white powder of the Sierra Nevada mountains. But the tragedy of the Donner Party is not that they were doomed from the start. The tragedy is that they were perfect. In the spring of 1846, America was caught in a fever. It was a condition known as manifest destiny, the belief that the American people were divinely ordained to expand across the continent, to tame the wild, and to touch the Pacific Ocean. Thousands of families were selling their farms, packing their lives into wooden wagons, and pointing their oxen west. They were chasing a rumor of a land called California, where the winter never came, where the soil was so rich you could plant a stick and watch it grow, and where a man could reinvent himself away from the debts and the diseases of the East. And in Springfield, Illinois, there were two families who decided that 1846 was their year. These were not desperate people. They were not refugees fleeing persecution. They were the elite. First, there was George Donner. He was 62 years old, a wealthy, respected farmer with a sprawling estate. He had a young wife, Tamsin, and a house full of daughters. George was a man who had already won at the game of life. He had money, he had land, and he had status. But George Donner had an itch. He wanted one last great adventure. He wanted to see the ocean. And then there was James Reed. If George Donner was the wallet of the expedition, James Reed was the ego. Reed was 45, an Irish-born aristocrat who had made a fortune in furniture manufacturing and railroads. He was a man accustomed to being obeyed. He was intelligent, fiery, and fiercely proud. James Reed didn't just want to go to California, he wanted to go in style. Most pioneers traveled in standard farm wagons, cramped, rough, canvas-covered boxes that rattled the teeth out of your skull. But James Reed was not a man who rattled. For this journey, Reed commissioned a custom-built wagon that the other pioneers would stare at in awe. They called it the Palace Car. It was a behemoth. It was 2 stories tall. The entrance was on the side, like a train car, rather than the back. Inside, it was fitted with a customized iron stove for heating, cushioned seats that folded into comfortable beds, and even a large mirror so the ladies could check their appearance before stepping out onto the prairie. It was a marvel of engineering. It was a mobile fortress of comfort designed to insulate Reed's wife, who suffered from terrible migraines, and his 4 children from the harsh realities of the wild. But to the experienced frontiersman who saw it, the palace car didn't look like luxury. It looked like a tomb. It was too heavy. It required a team of 8 oxen just to get it moving. Its wheels were too wide for the narrow, rocky trails of the mountains. It was a symbol of Reed's hubris, the belief that he could bring his civilization with him, that he could buy his way out of the struggle. But on April 14th, 1846, none of that mattered. The morning they left Springfield was perfect. The grass was green, The sky was a piercing blue, and the air was filled with the smell of damp earth and optimism. Tamsin Donner, George's wife, wrote a letter to a friend back home. Her words capture the heartbreaking innocence of the moment. She wrote, "We are all in good health and spirits. I am willing to go and have no doubt it will be an advantage to our children and to us." She described the journey not as a survival mission, but as a pleasure trip. She packed schoolbooks for her children. She packed watercolors and knitting needles. She packed bolts of velvet and satin. James Reed packed fine wines and brandy, intending to toast his success when they arrived in the California sun. They had everything they needed. They had the money. They had the best wagons money could buy. They had a library of guidebooks, including a new popular book by a man named Lansford Hastings, a book that promised a new secret route that would shave 300 miles off the journey. They rolled out of Illinois with the wind at their backs, watching the familiar world of fences and farmhouses fade into the rear view. They were 87 people in total, men, women, children, and infants. They were a travelling city, a caravan of hope moving at 2 miles per hour. As they crossed the plains, the children played tag alongside the wagons. The men hunted buffalo and told stories around the campfire at night. The women cooked elaborate meals on the open prairie. For the first few weeks, it felt like a picnic that would never end, but they didn't know that the clock was already ticking. They didn't know that for every hour they spent enjoying the pleasure trip in the easy grass of the Midwest, the snow was quietly gathering in the peaks of the Sierra Nevada, waiting for them. They didn't know that the massive palace car, the symbol of their wealth, would become an anchor that would drag them down. And they certainly didn't know that the book James Reed was reading, the guide that promised them a shortcut, was written by a man who had never actually travelled the road he was selling. The golden dream was real, but they were walking straight into a trap, and the trap was about to snap shut. Chapter 2. The Salesman and the Lie. If you were to look at a map of the American West in 1846, the route to California was already well established. It was a long, arduous curve that swung north through Idaho, following the Snake River before dropping down into the safety of the California valleys. It was known as the California Trail. It was predictable. It was safe. And for a man like James Reed, it was agonizingly slow. James Reed was a man of the industrial age, living in a world of ox carts. He was a man who understood efficiency, leverage, and speed. He looked at the map, at that great looping northern curve, and he saw inefficiency. He saw wasted time. He saw wasted money. To a man like Reed, the idea that one had to travel hundreds of miles out of the way just to go west seemed absurd. Surely there had to be a straight line. And that is when he found the book. It was a slim volume, bound in paper, titled The Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California. The author was a man named Lansford Hastings. History has painted many villains in the saga of the Donner Party. We often blame the snow, we blame the cold, we blame the hunger. But before the snow ever fell, before the first pang of hunger ever struck, the Donner Party was doomed by the ambition of Lansford Hastings. Hastings was not a guide. He was not a mountain man. He was a lawyer from Ohio with grand political ambitions. He had travelled to California once, arriving just a few years earlier, and he had seen an opportunity. He believed that if he could encourage enough Americans to settle in California, which was then still part of Mexico, they could eventually overthrow the Mexican government and establish an independent republic. And who better to lead this new republic than the man who brought them there? Lansford Hastings saw himself as the future president of California, but to get the voters, he first had to get the people. So he wrote a book. In The Emigrant's Guide, Hastings laid out a revolutionary new idea. He proposed a new route, a straight shot across the Great Basin. He claimed that by cutting south of the Great Salt Lake, travelers could shave 300, perhaps even 400 miles off their journey. The prose was confident. The direction seemed precise. Hastings wrote, the most direct route for the California emigrants would be to leave the Oregon route, about 200 miles east of Fort Hall, thence bearing west-southwest to the Salt Lake, and thence continuing down to the Bay of San Francisco. It sounded logical. It sounded easy. There was just one problem. When Lansford Hastings wrote those words, he had never actually travelled the route himself. He had stared at a map, drawn a line with his finger across the blank spaces of the Utah desert, and decided that it looked like a road. He didn't know about the salt flats that were soft enough to swallow a wagon whole. He didn't know about the Ruby Mountains that had no passes for wagons. He didn't know that the water he promised was often poisonous alkali springs that would kill an ox in hours. He was selling a dream, and James Reed, sitting in his comfortable home in Illinois, bought it, hook, line, and sinker. The book became Reed's Bible. He read it to the other families. He showed them the logic of the straight line. Why spend weeks navigating the difficult Snake River when they could simply cut across the basin and be in California weeks ahead of schedule? The Donner brothers, George and Jacob, were older men. The idea of saving weeks of travel appealed to their weary bones. The Hastings Cutoff became the talk of the wagon train. It was the secret weapon that would make their journey the envy of the frontier. But the wilderness has a way of warning you, if you are willing to listen. On June 27th, 1846, the Donner Party arrived at Fort Laramie in present-day Wyoming. This was the last major outpost of civilization before the grueling push through the mountains. It was a place where travelers could rest, repair their wagons, and trade news with the fur, trappers and mountain men coming from the west. It was here that James Reed met a ghost from his past. By sheer coincidence, an old friend of Reed's named James Clyman was at the fort. Clyman was the real deal. He was a grizzled, seasoned mountain man who had walked the very terrain that Hastings was writing about. He had just come east from California on horseback, travelling with Lansford Hastings himself. Clyman and Hastings had parted ways on the trail, but Clyman knew exactly what the cutoff looked like. He had seen the desolate canyons. He had ridden across the blistering salt desert. When Reed told Clyman about his plan to take the Hastings Cutoff, Clyman went pale. We have records of this conversation. It is one of the most tragic what-if moments in American history. Clyman sat Reed down and told him, in no uncertain terms, that the route was a death trap. "Take the regular wagon track," Clyman urged. "It is the only route that is safe. The other way is impossible. For wagons, you will lose your stock. You will lose your time. You will lose your lives." Clyman explained that while a man on a horse might be able to scramble through the canyons, a heavy wagon, let alone the massive palace car Reed was hauling, would never make it. He described the waterless stretch of the salt desert, a white hell where the sun reflected off the ground with enough intensity to blind a man. He pleaded with Reed. He told him that Hastings was a fraud, a man who cared more about his own fame than the lives of the families he was guiding. But James Reed didn't listen. Why? Psychologists might call it confirmation bias. Reed had already made up his mind. He had invested his ego in the idea of the shortcut. He was the leader who had discovered the better way. To admit that he was wrong, to admit that the book he had been preaching from was a lie, would have been a humiliation. Furthermore, Reed looked at Clyman, a rough, dirty man in buckskins, and he looked at himself, a wealthy, educated businessman. Reed believed in the power of progress. He believed that men like Clyman were stuck in the past, afraid of innovation. Reed told Clyman, "There is a nigher route, and we might as well take it." Clyman shook his head. His final words to Reed were a chilling prophecy. "If you take that route, you will not live to see California." The party left Fort Laramie, still undecided but leaning heavily toward the shortcut. As they pushed westward, the landscape began to change. The green prairies gave way to sagebrush and rock. The air grew drier. The days grew hotter. They reached Fort Bridger in late July. This was the point of no return. This was where the trail split, the right fork leading to the safety of Fort Hall and the established route, the left fork leading into the unknown of the Hastings Cutoff. Lansford Hastings was supposed to be there. He had promised to wait at Fort Bridger to guide the emigrants personally, but when the Donner Party arrived, Hastings was gone. He had already left with a large group of wagons that had arrived a week earlier, but he had left a note. It was a letter posted at the fort, instructing any latecomers to follow his tracks. He assured them that the road was fine, that the water was plentiful, and that the journey would be easy. This was the second lie. The owners of Fort Bridger, Jim Bridger, and Louis Vasquez were also complicit in the deception. They knew the route was dangerous, but they also knew that if the emigrants took the established route via Fort Hall, they would bypass Fort Bridger entirely. The fort would lose business, so, when the Donner Party asked for advice, Bridger and Vasquez lied. They told the families that the cutoff was a smooth, level road. They claimed there was only one dry stretch of roughly 30 miles, an easy 2-day crossing. It was a conspiracy of greed and ambition. Hastings wanted fame, Bridger wanted customers, and the Donner Party was the currency they were trading. The families held a meeting. There was dissent. Some of the women were terrified. They looked at the dark mountains to the south and felt a primal fear. They wanted to stick to the known path, but the men, led by Reed and the Donner brothers, were swayed by the promise of speed. They were already running late. The season was turning. If they took the long way, they risked hitting the winter snows. If they took the shortcut, they could beat the winter. It is a cruel irony. They chose the shortcut to avoid the snow, and by doing so, they walked directly into the worst winter in recorded history. On July 31st, 1846, the Donner Party turned their oxen to the left. They left the beaten track. They left the maps. They left the world of known things. As the wheels of the palace car crunched over the sagebrush, forging a new path into the dust, the families felt a surge of excitement. They were pioneers. They were blazing a trail. Behind them, the dust settled on the road they didn't take, the road that would have led them to safety, to warmth, and to life. Ahead of them lay the Wasatch Mountains, rugged, jagged, and unforgiving. And beyond that, the Great Salt Lake Desert. The salesman had sold them a lie, and the price of that lie was about to be paid in blood. Chapter 3. The 80-Mile Desert. The map is not the territory. It is a lesson that every explorer learns, usually at the cost of their own safety. But for the Donner Party, this lesson arrived not as a whisper, but as a sledgehammer. When they turned their wagons south from Fort Bridger, leaving the established safety of the California Trail behind, they believed they were entering a shortcut. They believed they were trading a few weeks of easy travel for a direct line to paradise. But almost immediately, the land began to fight them. The Hastings Cutoff was not a road. It wasn't even a trail. It was a theoretical line drawn across a wilderness that had never seen a feast wheel. The first obstacle was Weber Canyon. It was a jagged, twisting throat of red rock and tangled underbrush. The road that Lansford Hastings had promised simply did not exist. Instead of rolling prairies, the emigrants found themselves hacking through dense thickets of willow and aspen. They were not traveling anymore. They were road building. Every mile had to be fought for. The men, stripped to their waists, swung axes from dawn until dusk, clearing a path wide enough for the wagons. They moved boulders with pry bars. They filled ravines with dirt. They were averaging less than 2 miles a day. And then, on August 6th, they found the note. It was a scrap of paper stuck to a sagebrush by the side of the trail. It was tattered, fluttering in the hot wind. It was from Lansford Hastings himself. He was ahead of them, guiding the group that had left earlier. The note was a warning. Hastings wrote that the canyon ahead was impassable for wagons. He advised any following groups to stop and send a messenger ahead to find him, so he could come back and show them a better way through the mountains. James Reed, desperate to salvage his decision, rode ahead on horseback. He rode for days, finally catching up to Hastings. But Hastings, busy with his own struggling group, refused to come back. He simply pointed vaguely toward a different ridge and told Reed to try that way instead. Reed returned to the party with the bad news. They had to backtrack. They had to carve a new path over the mountains. For 21 days, they hacked their way through the Wasatch Mountains. 21 days of back-breaking labor to cover just 36 miles. By the time they emerged from the mountains and looked out over the Great Salt Lake, It was late August. The summer was dying. The oxen were exhausted, their ribs showing through their hides. The morale of the group was beginning to splinter. The pleasure trip was over, but the worst was not behind them. It was directly ahead. Lying before them was the Great Salt Lake Desert. In his guide, Hastings had described this section with a breezy confidence. He called it a dry drive of about 40 miles. He claimed it would take 2 days, perhaps a difficult 2 days, but manageable if they carried water and grass. 40 miles is a long way for an ox pulling a heavy wagon, but it is survivable. The emigrants did the math. If they travelled day and night, stopping only briefly, they could cross it in 48 hours. They prepared. They cut as much grass as they could carry. They filled every barrel, every bucket, and every boot with water. They cooked food in advance. They looked out at the shimmering white horizon, steeling themselves for a hard push. On August 30th, they drove their wagons onto the salt. At first the surface was hard and smooth, like a paved floor of white marble. The wheels rolled easily. The silence was absolute. There were no birds, no insects, no wind, just the rhythmic crunch of hooves on salt and the creaking of the wood. But as the sun rose, the desert revealed its true nature. The heat was oppressive. It radiated from the sky and reflected off the white ground, creating a convection oven effect. The glare was blinding. Men wrapped rags around their faces to protect their eyes, but the light found its way in, throbbing behind their eyelids. And then, the ground changed. Beneath the thin crust of hard salt lay a layer of thick grey mud, a mixture of salt, water, and clay that had the consistency of wet concrete. The heavy wagons broke through the crust. Suddenly, the wheels were sinking up to the hubs. The oxen, their hooves punching through the fragile surface, began to panic. They floundered in the muck, their legs coated in the stinging brine. The men whipped the animals, screaming at them to pull, but the mud sucked them down. The palace car, James Reed's symbol of wealth and status, became a liability. Its massive weight drove it, deeper into the mud than any other wagon. The oxen strained against the yoke, their eyes rolling in terror, foam dripping from their mouths. Day 1 passed. They had not crossed the desert. Night fell, but it brought no relief. The temperature dropped, but the thirst remained. They kept moving, guided by the stars, hoping that the other side was just a few miles away. Day 2 dawned. By Hastings's estimate, they should have been seeing the mountains on the other side, but when the sun rose, all they saw was an endless, terrifying expanse of white. 36 hours. 48 hours. The water ran out. The oxen began to go mad. Dehydration in cattle is a gruesome process. Their tongues swelled in their mouths. They began to bellow, a low, mournful sound that echoed across the flat emptiness. Some of the animals simply lay down in the salt and refused to rise, resigning themselves to death. Others broke their restraints and bolted, running blindly into the desert in search of water that didn't exist. And then came the mirages. The heat shimmer on the horizon played tricks on the desperate minds of the emigrants. They saw lakes, massive, blue, cool lakes, shimmering in the distance. Fathers would point them out to their children, promising them that water was just ahead. They would drive the wagons toward the vision, only to watch it evaporate into salt and dust as they approached. For James Reed, the desert was a personal apocalypse. His oxen, the finest team in the company, went insane from thirst. Unyoked from the palace car to give them a moment of relief, they caught the scent of water, or perhaps a hallucination of it, and bolted into the darkness. Reed rode after them, searching for miles, but they were gone. He returned to find his family stranded. The palace car, the 2-story marvel of the frontier, was immovable. It was a shipwreck in a dry ocean. There, in the middle of the Great Salt Lake Desert, the social hierarchy of the Donner Party collapsed. James Reed, the aristocrat, was now a beggar. He had to humiliate himself. He had to ask other families he had previously looked down upon, to take in his children and his wife. They had to abandon the palace car. They took what they could carry and left the rest. As they walked away, looking back over their shoulders. The desert was littered with the debris of their shattered dreams. Expensive furniture, books, fine china, and heavy trunks were tossed out of wagons to lighten the loads. The trail was marked not by milestones, but by mahogany dressers and dead oxen. It didn't take 2 days. It took 6. The dry drive was not 40 miles. It was 80 miles. Lansford Hastings had underestimated the distance by double. When the Donner Party finally stumbled off the salt and reached the springs at the base of Pilot Peak, they were a broken people. They threw themselves into the water, drinking alongside their animals. They wept, they prayed, but as the adrenaline faded, the cold reality of their situation set in. They had survived the desert, but the cost was catastrophic. 36 oxen were dead or lost. Several wagons had been abandoned. The unity of the group was shattered. Every family was now looking out for itself, hoarding its remaining supplies. The trust in James Reed was gone. He was no longer the leader. He was the man who had led them into hell. But the most dangerous loss was the one they couldn't see yet: time. They had spent days hacking through Weber Canyon. They had spent nearly a week crossing the salt desert. They had spent days recovering their strength at the springs. It was now mid-September. In a normal year, a wagon train should be crossing the Sierra Nevada by early September. They were still hundreds of miles away. High above them, in the peaks they could not yet see, the first snowflakes of the season were beginning to form. The trap that had been set in Illinois was now fully primed. The door was closing, and they were still walking toward it. Chapter 4. The Murder. The calendar had turned to October. In the high latitudes of the American West, October is not a month of harvest and golden light. It is a warning. The sun begins to retreat earlier each day. The nights grow longer, and the temperature drops with a sudden, violent sharpness that freezes the water in the buckets by morning. For the Donner Party, the first week of October, 1846, was not just a battle against the elements. It was a battle against their own unraveling psychology. They were no longer the optimistic caravan that had left Illinois with flags flying and children playing in the tall grass. They were survivors of a war they didn't know they were fighting. The salt desert had taken their oxen. The Hastings Cutoff had taken their time. And the constant grinding fear that they were going to die in the wilderness had taken their humanity. The social fabric of the group, the polite civilized laws that governed life in the United States, was beginning to fray. In a city, if you have a dispute with your neighbor, you call the sheriff. You go to court. You rely on the structure of society to mediate the conflict. But out here, on the dusty banks of the Humboldt River, there was no sheriff. There was no judge. There was only the sand, the sagebrush, and the raw, unfiltered anger of men who were watching their families starve. The tension in the camp was physical. You could feel it in the way the men looked at each other over the campfires. You could hear it in the way they whipped their oxen, lashes that were struck not just with urgency but with rage. They were looking for someone to blame. And the target of their collective hatred was the man who had convinced them to take the shortcut, James Reed. Reed was already a diminished figure. The palace car, his symbol of aristocracy, was a wreck. He had lost so many oxen in the desert that he was forced to cache his expensive furniture in the sand. But his attitude remained. He was still the leader. He was still the man on the horse, riding up and down the line, giving orders, trying to keep the ragged group moving. To the other families, the Graves, the Breens, the Kesselbergs, Reed's continued authority was an insult. They whispered that he was arrogant. They whispered that he cared more about his own family than the group. They whispered that it was his fault they were late. On October 5th, 1846, at a place called Iron Point near present-day Winnemucca, Nevada, the whispers turned into blood. The geography of the disaster was simple. The trail led up a steep, sandy hill. The sand was deep and soft, dragging at the wagon wheels like quicksand. The oxen, weak from lack of food and water, could barely find traction. To get the heavy wagons up the incline, the families had to double team, hitching multiple teams of oxen to a single wagon to drag it to the top, then going back down for the next one. It was backbreaking, frustrating work. Tempers were short. The air was thick with dust and the shouting of drivers. James Reed was riding ahead. His teamster, a loyal man named Milt Elliott, was driving Reed's wagon. Ahead of them was the wagon of the Graves family, driven by a young popular man named John Snyder. John Snyder was everything James Reed was not. He was young, strong, and beloved by the group. He was courting one of the Graves' daughters, Mary. He was seen as the future of the party, a man who worked hard and didn't put on airs. But on this day, Snyder was at his breaking point. His oxen were tangling with Reed's team. The animals, panicked by the steep slope and the shouting, began to weave together, their horns clashing. Snyder lost control. He began to whip his oxen ferociously. He struck them over the head again and again, the heavy leather cracking against their skulls. It was a display of violence that went beyond droving. It was a release of all the frustration of the past 2 months. James Reed rode back to see what the commotion was. When he saw Snyder beating the animals, he shouted at him to stop. "Do not beat the animals," Reed commanded. "You are killing them." Snyder, blinded by rage and dust, turned his fury on Reed. He shouted back, cursing Reed, telling him to get out of the way. He told Reed that he would whip the oxen if he wanted to, and that he would whip Reed too. In the hierarchy of 1846, this was a dangerous moment. A teamster threatening a gentleman leader was a breach of order. But the order was already gone. Reed attempted to settle the situation. He rode closer, trying to untangle the teams himself. That was the spark. Snyder, perhaps thinking Reed was going to strike him, reversed his bullwhip. He gripped the leather lash and swung the heavy lead-weighted wooden handle like a club. He struck James Reed across the head. The blow opened a gash in Reed's scalp. Blood poured down his face, blinding him in one eye. Reed's wife, Margaret, ran forward. She threw herself between the two men, screaming for them to stop. Snyder struck again. This time, the heavy whip handle hit Margaret Reed. The sight of his wife being struck snapped something in James Reed. He was no longer the leader of an expedition. He was a husband, defending his family. He drew his hunting knife, a large, sharp blade he carried on his belt. He lunged. It happened in a blur of dust and motion. Snyder raised the whip for a third strike, and Reed drove the knife upward. The blade entered Snyder's chest, just below the collarbone. It severed the lung and cut the artery. Snyder staggered back. He dropped the whip. He looked down at his chest, then up at the horrified crowd that had gathered. "I am a dead man," he whispered. He collapsed into the sand. Within moments, John Snyder was dead. The silence that followed was heavier than the heat. It was the silence of a line being crossed. For the first time on the journey, a member of the party had died, not by accident, not by disease, but by the hand of another member. The shock instantly turned to fury. The Graves family threw themselves over Snyder's body, weeping and wailing. But the other families, specifically the Kesselbergs, saw an opportunity. Louis Kesselberg, a German immigrant who had long harbored a deep hatred for Reed, began to shout. He called Reed a murderer. He called for justice. And in the wilderness, justice meant only one thing. "Hang him," Kesselberg shouted. "Hang the murderer." The cry was taken up by the others. They were tired. They were scared. And now they had a focal point for all their suffering. If they killed Reed, they could purge the bad luck that had followed them. They could take revenge on the man who had led them into the desert. They propped up the tongues of 2 wagons and tied them together to form a makeshift gallows. They found a rope. They were going to lynch James Reed right there, on the side of the sandy hill, with the blood of John Snyder still wet on the ground. Reed did not flee. He stood by his wagon, cleaning the blood from his face, holding his weeping wife. He admitted he had stabbed Snyder, but he claimed self-defense. He had been struck. His wife had been struck. He had no choice. But the mob didn't care about self-defense. They wanted blood. It was only the intervention of the women that saved him. Margaret Reed pleaded with the other wives. She begged them to consider her children. She begged them to remember that Reed had been trying to stop the violence, not start it. And then a compromise was reached, a compromise that was perhaps crueler than death. They would not hang James Reed, but he could not stay. He was banished. The terms were absolute. James Reed was to leave the camp immediately. He was to walk out into the desert alone. He was not allowed to take a wagon. He was not allowed to take food, though at the last moment his daughter, Virginia, managed to sneak him a rifle and a small amount of crackers. He was to leave his wife and 4 children behind with the group that now hated them. It was a death sentence. To walk alone in the Nevada wilderness, with winter approaching, without shelter or support, was suicide. But James Reed was a man of immense pride. He did not beg. He kissed his wife. He hugged his children. He told them he would ride ahead to California, that he would cross the mountains alone, find food, and come back with a rescue party. It was a lie told to comfort them, but it was also a spark of the indomitable will that defined the man. He mounted his horse, which he was eventually allowed to take, as it was his property, and rode out of the camp. The 86 remaining members of the Donner Party watched him go. They watched the man who had organized the trip, the man who had dreamed of the Pacific Ocean, fade into the dust of the horizon. When he disappeared, a profound sense of doom settled over the wagons. They had gotten their justice, but they had paid a terrible price. They had exiled their most capable leader. James Reed was arrogant, yes. He was flawed, yes. But he was also intelligent, resourceful, and driven. He was the one man who might have been able to organize the group when the snows came. Now, he was gone. The group was leaderless. The families retreated into their own wagons. The communal spirit was dead. From this moment on, it was every family for itself. The Breen family looked out for the Breens. The Graves family looked out for the Graves. The Donners looked out for the Donners. As they buried John Snyder in the sand, just a few feet from the trail, they did not know that the first flakes of snow were already falling on the peaks of the Sierra Nevada, just 100 miles to the west. They did not know that by banishing James Reed, they had sealed their own fate. The murder at Iron Point was the end of the Donner Party as a society. What remained was just a collection of terrified individuals, walking slowly toward a white wall that was waiting to swallow them whole. The days grew shorter, the nights grew colder, and the mountains, silent and white, were waiting. Chapter 5. The Wall. The desert was behind them, but the mountains were ahead. In late October 1846, the geography of the American West shifts dramatically. You leave the high arid plains of Nevada, a land of dust, sagebrush, and cracked earth, and you collide with the Sierra Nevada. In Spanish, Sierra Nevada means snowy mountain range. It is an apt name. These mountains are not like the rolling Appalachians of the east, nor are they like the Rockies, which often have wide, navigable passes. The Sierras are a granite fortress. They rise abruptly from the desert floor, shooting up thousands of feet into the air, creating a jagged spine that blocks the moisture coming off the Pacific Ocean. When the wet ocean air hits that granite wall, it rises, cools, and drops its moisture. In the summer, this creates rain. In the winter, it creates snow. And not just snow, it creates a burial. The Sierra Nevada is one of the snowiest places on Earth. In a bad year, the snowfall is measured, not in inches, but in stories. Drifts can reach 30, 40, even 60 feet. It is a place where the landscape itself changes shape, where valleys are filled in and peaks are smoothed over by a white blanket that weighs millions of tons. This was the enemy that was waiting for the Donner Party. After the banishment of James Reed, the group was fractured. They were moving, but they were moving like a wounded animal, slow, erratic, and bleeding time. They had lost weeks in the Ruby Mountains. They had lost weeks in the salt desert. They were exhausted. The oxen were skeletons wrapped in hide, their heads drooping low, their hooves splitting on the rocks. But on October 19th, a spark of hope returned to the company. Charles Stanton, a bachelor who had ridden ahead to California weeks earlier to get supplies, came riding back. To the ragged emigrants, Stanton must have looked like an angel. He wasn't alone. He brought with him 7 mules loaded with flour and dried beef. He had ridden all the way to Sutter's Fort in California, secured provisions, and incredibly, he had turned around and ridden back into the jaws of winter to save his friends. He He also brought 2 guides. Their names were Luis and Salvador. They were Miwok men, employed by Captain Sutter. They knew the mountains. They knew the trails. They knew the signs of the weather. Stanton brought news that was both good and terrifying. The good news, the pass through the mountains was still open. The bad news, it wouldn't be open for long. He told the families that they had to move, now. They had to strip the wagons of everything that wasn't essential. They had to ignore the exhaustion of the cattle. They had to race. If they had listened to Charles Stanton on October 19th, the history of the American West would be different. If they had whipped their oxen and driven through the night, they would have crossed the pass on October 25th or 26th. They would have rolled down the western slopes into the California valleys before the first flake fell. But they didn't. They were human, and they were tired. When they reached the Truckee Meadows, the present-day site of Reno, Nevada, they saw grass. Lush, green, sweet grass. Water flowed in the river. The sun was shining. It was a paradise compared to the hell of the salt desert they had just survived. The families argued that the cattle needed to rest. If they pushed the animals into the steep climb of the pass without rest, the oxen would die, and they would be stranded anyway. They needed a few days, just 3 or 4 days, to let the animals graze and regain their strength. It was a logical decision. It was a compassionate decision. It was a fatal decision. They camped in the meadows. They let the oxen feed. They washed their clothes in the river. For a brief moment, the terror of the journey receded. They were only 50 miles from the pass. They could see the mountains looming above them, grey and silent against the blue sky. They looked peaceful, but the mountains are patient. During this rest, another tragedy struck. A small mechanical failure that would have massive consequences. 2 men, William Foster and William Pike, were cleaning a pistol by the campfire. It was a pepper-box pistol, an old-fashioned, unreliable weapon. As Pike was handing the gun to Foster, the mechanism slipped. The gun discharged. The bullet struck William Pike in the back. He died 20 minutes later in agony. Pike was a young man, a father. His death cast another pall over the group. They had to stop to bury him. The ground was hard. The digging took time. The mourning took time. Every hour they spent digging that grave was an hour the storm drew closer. Finally, around October 25th, the group began the final push. They left the meadows and entered the canyon that led to the pass. The terrain here was brutal. The trail followed the Truckee River, crossing it back and forth over large, slippery boulders. The wagons had to be heaved over rocks. The oxen, despite their rest, began to falter again. And then, the party split. The Donner family, George, his brother Jacob, and their many children were lagging behind. Their wagons were heavy with goods they refused to abandon. On a steep section of the trail, the front axle of George Donner's wagon snapped. It was a catastrophic break. To fix a wagon axle in the wilderness requires chopping down a tree, seasoning the wood, shaping it and fitting it. It is a day-long job, at minimum. George Donner was a stubborn man. He decided to stop and fix the wagon properly. He told the rest of the group, the Breens, the Murphys, the Graves, the Kiesebergs, to go ahead. He would catch up, but while carving the new axle, the chisel slipped. The sharp steel sliced into the back of George Donner's hand. It was a deep, ugly gash. In a sterile hospital, it would be stitches. In the dirt of the Sierra Nevada, it was a death sentence. The wound would eventually become gangrenous, turning his blood to poison, rendering the leader of the party an invalid just when his family needed him most. The main group pushed on without the Donners. They were now a few miles ahead, approaching the foot of the lake that sat directly beneath the mountain pass. It was October 31st, Halloween. The sky began to change. For weeks, the sky had been a harsh, relentless blue, but now a grey shroud began to pull itself over the peaks. The temperature plunged. The wind, which usually blew from the west, shifted and began to swirl. Luis and Salvador, the Miwok guides, looked at the sky and knew what was coming. They urged the families to abandon the wagons. They told them to put the children on the mules and run for the pass. But the emigrants were married to their wagons. Their entire lives, their heirlooms, their money, their tools for the new life, were in those wooden boxes. They refused to leave them. They reached the shores of the lake. Above them, the pass rose like a wall. It was a 1,000-foot climb of sheer granite, a narrow notch in the skyline that marked the gateway to California. They started the ascent. The wagons clawed their way up the rocky slope. The oxen slipped and scrambled. The men shouted and pushed. They made it halfway up, and then the first flake fell. It wasn't a storm at first, it was a silence. A soft white dust began to settle on the dark pine trees. It settled on the backs of the oxen. It settled on the bonnets of the women. Then the snow began to thicken. The flakes grew larger, heavier. The wind picked up, driving the snow horizontally, blinding the drivers. The ground, which had been hard rock moments ago, became slick. The wheels lost traction. The oxen couldn't find their footing. They slid backward, dragging the wagons with them. The families panicked. They unhitched the oxen and tried to drive them over the pass without the wagons, hoping to come back for the goods later. They pushed the animals into the drifts, but the snow was accumulating at a terrifying rate, 1 inch an hour, then 2 inches. By the time they reached the upper elevations, the snow was already 5 feet deep. The trail was gone. The landmarks were gone. The pass was just a white blur in the grey sky. The mules, laden with the children, floundered. They sank up to their bellies. They couldn't move. The children were crying, their tears freezing on their cheeks. Stanton and the 2 Indian guides tried to find the path. They waded through the drifts, searching for the blaze marks on the trees. But the trees were disappearing into the white void. Night fell. To be caught on the side of a mountain in a blizzard is to die. The temperature drops well below freezing. The wind sucks the heat from the body in minutes. The families realized they couldn't make it over. Not tonight. They had to retreat. It is the most heartbreaking moment of the entire journey. They were so close. The summit was right there, perhaps only 3 or 4 miles away. If they could just get over that ridge, the elevation would drop and the snow would turn to rain. Safety was 3 miles away, but 3 miles in 5 feet of snow might as well be the moon. Defeated, weeping, and freezing, they turned the animals around. They slid back down the mountain, back toward the lake. They huddled together in the existing shacks, a single dilapidated cabin built by a previous party years ago, and threw up makeshift tents. They told themselves it was just a storm. They told themselves it would stop in the morning. They told themselves the sun would come out, the snow would melt, and they would cross the pass in 2 days. But the snow didn't stop. It snowed for 8 days. When the sun finally broke through the clouds a week later, the world had changed. The lake was a sheet of grey ice. The wagons were buried. The pass was sealed behind a barrier of white that was now 20 feet deep. The trap had snapped shut. The wall was built. The Donner Party was no longer a wagon train. They were prisoners, and as the families looked out at the white prison that surrounded them, they realized with a dawning icy horror that the food they had, the cattle, the flour, the mules, would not last the winter. They were 81 souls, trapped in the freezing dark, with the cold creeping into their bones, and the hunger beginning to gnaw at their stomachs. The journey was over. The nightmare had begun. Chapter 6. The Cabins. When the storm finally broke in early November 1846, the world had been erased. The jagged peaks of the Sierra Nevada, the towering pine trees, the sharp granite boulders, everything was gone. In their place was a smooth, undulating ocean of white. The snow wasn't just on the ground, it was the atmosphere. It was a physical weight that pressed down on the lungs and the eyes. For the 81 survivors of the Donner Party, the concept of travel had ceased to exist. They were no longer a wagon train. They were a subterranean colony. The geography of the disaster is important to understand because it dictated who lived and who died. The party was not together. They were split into 2 distinct camps, separated by 6 miles of impossible terrain. The main camp was located at the foot of the lake, then called Truckee Lake, now known as Donner Lake. Here, the families of the Breens, the Murphys, the Eddies, the Kesselbergs, and the graves settled in. They didn't choose this spot because it was good. They chose it because they couldn't take another step. The shelter situation was medieval. The Breen family was the luckiest. They found a small crude cabin that had been built 2 years earlier by a previous group of emigrants, the Stevens Townsend Murphy Party. It was a dark, rotting box of pine logs, barely large enough for a single family, let alone the refugees who now crowded into it. But it had a roof. It had a fireplace. In the context of the Sierra winter, it was a palace. The other families at the lake were not so fortunate. They had to build, but you cannot build a log cabin when the snow is 5 feet deep and falling at an inch an hour. You cannot drag logs. You cannot mix mud for chinking. The Kieseberg family built a lean-to against the side of the Breen cabin. It was little more than a shed, a precarious structure of branches and hides that shook with every gust of wind. The Murphy family found a massive, vertical granite boulder, a rock the size of a house that stuck out of the ground near the lake. They used the rock as one wall and built a crude structure of logs and branches against it. It was cold, it was damp, and the rock face constantly wept freezing water into their living space. The Graves family, who had been a mile or so behind, built a cabin further down the creek. It was a double cabin, shared with the Reed children and the Stanton group, but the true horror was happening 6 miles away at Alder Creek. This was where the Donner families, George and Jacob, along with their wives, children, and teamsters, were trapped. Because of George's broken axle and his injured hand, they had fallen behind the main group. When the storm hit, they were caught in the open. They didn't have time to fell trees. They didn't have an existing cabin. They didn't have a large rock. They had to live in tents. The Donners constructed makeshift shelters using brush, quilts, buffalo robes, and canvas wagon covers. They piled snow up around the walls to act as insulation. Inside, there was no floor, only the frozen earth, which quickly turned into a swamp of mud and melted snow as the body heat of the occupants warmed it. There were 21 people at Alder Creek, including small children and infants. They were living in a structure that was essentially a blanket thrown over a bush. As November deepened into December, the snow continued to fall. It fell, with a relentlessness that defied logic. In the Midwest, a heavy snow might be 2 feet. In the Sierras, the snow level eventually reached 20 feet. The cabins were buried, literally. The snow rose past the windows. Then, it rose past the eaves. Finally, it covered the roofs entirely. To get outside, the survivors had to dig tunnels. They cut steps into the walls of snow that led up to the surface. From the outside, the camp was invisible. A rescue party skiing over the area would have seen nothing but a white wasteland, broken only by the occasional plume of grey smoke rising from holes in the snow. The chimneys of the buried families. Inside the cabins, it was a world of perpetual twilight. There were no windows, or if there were, they were blocked by 20 feet of snow. The only light came from the fire, which smoked incessantly because the wood was green and wet. The atmosphere was choking. Imagine a room, perhaps 14 feet by 14 feet, occupied by 12 or 13 people. There is no ventilation, there is no sanitation. The air is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, wet wool, rotting ox hides, and the acrid smoke of pine pitch. The silence was the worst part. Outside, the wind might be howling at 60 miles per hour, stripping the branches off the trees. But under the snow, in the cabins, it was dead silent. The snow acted as a perfect sound insulator. You couldn't hear the storm. You couldn't hear the world. You could only hear the breathing of the person next to you. You could hear the stomach of your child growling. Patrick Breen, the head of the Breen family, began to keep a diary. It is one of the most terrifying documents in American history, not because of what it describes, but because of how calm it is. He wrote about the weather. He wrote about the wind. He wrote about who was sick. Friday, November the 20th, 1846. Came to this place on the 31st of last month that it snowed. We went onto the pass, the snow so deep we were unable to find the road when within 3 miles of the summit. Then turned back to this shanty on the lake. We now have killed most part of our cattle, having to stay here until next spring, and live on poor beef, without bread or salt. Without bread or salt. It seems like a small detail, but it was psychological torture. The human body craves salt. Without it, food tastes like ash. And without bread, without carbohydrates, the meat of the starving lean oxen provided almost no energy. They were eating, but they were starving. The days blurred together. There was no schedule. There was no work to be done, other than the exhausting calorie-burning chore of climbing the snow steps to cut firewood. The men, strong, capable farmers who were used to working 12 hours a day, began to atrophy. They sat by the fires, staring into the flames. Depression, heavy and suffocating, settled over the camp. At Alder Creek, the situation was even worse. George Donner, the leader of the expedition, was rotting. The cut on his hand had become gangrenous. The infection was spreading up his arm. He was feverish, delirious, and bedridden. Tamsin Donner, his wife, was a woman of immense strength. She nursed him, she cared for the children, and she tried to keep the flimsy tent from collapsing under the weight of the snow. But the snow was a living thing. It shifted. It melted. It froze. One night, the heat from the fire melted the snowbank that formed the wall of the Donner tent. The water seeped in, soaking the bedding, soaking the children. They woke up wet and freezing in the dark, with nowhere to go. They had to stand in the mud, shivering, waiting for morning, waiting for the clothes to dry on their bodies. At the lake camp, the families began to hoard. The communal spirit of the wagon train had died at Iron Point with the banishment of James Reed. Now, buried in the dark, the paranoia set in. The Breens had the most cattle. They had managed to butcher their oxen before they were lost in the drifts. The Eddies and the Murphys had almost nothing. Their cattle had run off in the storm, or had been buried alive in the drifts, lost forever under the white blanket. The Kieserbergs were suffering. Louis Kieserberg, the man who had called for Reed's hanging, had injured his foot. He was immobile. He lay in his lean-to, watching his wife and child waste away. The social contract evaporated. When a family ran out of food, they would ask their neighbours, and their neighbours would say no. It wasn't cruelty, it was arithmetic. If I give you my beef, my children die. If I keep it, your children die. Mr. Eddy, desperate to feed his family, killed a coyote. It was stringy, tough, and tasted of sagebrush. But it was meat. He fed it to his wife and children. Then he killed an owl. Then he found nothing. The cabins were not homes. They were waiting rooms. The people inside were waiting for the snow to stop, or they were waiting to die. As December arrived, the snow depth increased. The firewood became harder to find. The men had to climb higher and higher up the trees to cut branches, risking falls into the deep powder where a man could suffocate if he couldn't get his footing. The oxen that had not been butchered were dying of starvation. They were essentially skeletons standing in the snow. When they were finally killed, there was no fat on them. The meat was poor, as Breen described it. It offered no sustenance. It was just fibre. The children stopped playing. They stopped crying. They entered a state of lethargy, conserving every ounce of energy. Their eyes grew large in their gaunt faces. They watched the adults. They watched the fire. And the adults watched the snow. Every morning, they would crawl up the tunnel to the surface, hoping to see blue sky. And every morning, they would see grey. The wall was holding. The trap was secure. And inside the buried cabins, the food supply was ticking down to zero. The beefy yen was gone. The flour was gone. They were about to enter the next phase of the horror, the phase where the leather of the shoes, the hide of the roof, and the bones of the dead became the only things left to eat. The cabins, once a refuge from the storm, had become tombs, and the people inside were beginning to realize that they might never leave. Chapter 7. The Hunger by mid-December. 1846. The geography of the Donner Party had shrunk. The world was no longer a continent. It was no longer a state. It wasn't even a valley. The The world was now defined by the four walls of a buried cabin, or the canvas flaps of a submerged tent. The entire universe consisted of the fire, the snow ramp leading to the surface, and the pot. And the pot was becoming the center of their religion. To understand the horror of what happened next, we have to understand the timeline of starvation. It does not happen all at once. It is a slow, agonizing subtraction. It takes the fat first, then it takes the muscle, then it attacks the mind. When the Donner Party first became trapped in early November, they still had their cattle. They had oxen that had pulled the wagons across the plains. They had horses, they had mules, but these animals were not livestock in the traditional sense. They were wrecks. They had just crossed the salt desert and the mountains. They were skeletal, dehydrated, and exhausted. When the snows came and buried the grass, the animals began to die of starvation themselves. The men tried to butcher them. In the blinding storms of November, they went out into the drifts, feeling for the bodies of the cattle with long poles. When they found one, they would dig it out, butcher the frozen carcass, and drag the meat back to the cabins. But the meat was poor. That was the word Patrick Breen used in his diary. Poor beef. It means meat with no fat. It is stringy, tough, and fibrous. In survival terms, it is almost useless. The human body runs on calories. In the freezing cold of the high Sierras, a body needs 4,000 to 5,000 calories a day just to maintain its core temperature. A pound of lean, fat-free beef might provide only 600 calories. They were eating, but they were freezing to death from the inside out. And then, the meat ran out. This is the moment where the history books usually skip forward. They jump from they ran out of food to they ate the dead. But there is a missing chapter in between. There is a period of weeks of innovation, of desperation, and of culinary horror, where the families tried to eat the inedible to avoid crossing the final line. They began with the dogs. The Donner Party had brought many dogs with them. They were beloved pets, guardians, and hunting companions. In the early days of the entrapment, the dogs were allowed to sleep in the cabins to provide warmth, but as the hunger sharpened, the dogs ceased to be pets. They became calories. The Murphy family had a dog. The Eddies had a dog. One by one, they were killed. There was no ceremony. There was no mourning. The hunger was too loud for sentiment. They ate everything, the muscle, the organs, the brains. They cracked the bones to suck out the marrow. But the dogs were small. They didn't last long. And when the dogs were gone, the families turned to the only organic material left in their possession, their own shelter. The roofs of the cabins were not made of shingles or slate. They were made of raw ox hides, the skins of the cattle they had slaughtered weeks ago. The hides had been stretched over the pine poles to keep out the snow. They were hard, frozen, and covered in hair. They were tanned by the sun and the smoke. They were, for all intents and purposes, leather. But they were animal. And if they were animal, the survivors reasoned, they could be food. The process of preparing the hides was a gruesome ritual that consumed the days of the women. First, the hide had to be stripped from the roof. This meant exposing the cabin to the cold, or digging it out from the snowbank. The hide was frozen solid, stiff as a board. They would bring the frozen slab inside the cabin and thaw it by the fire. As it thawed, it would begin to smell, a rank, wet, animal odor that filled the small, airless room. Once thawed, the hair had to be removed. They would singe the hair off with hot coals, filling the cabin with the stench of burning fur. Then, they would scrape the skin with knives, trying to remove the soot and the dirt. But you cannot eat leather. It is too tough. It is chemically bonded. So they boiled it. They would cut the hides into long strips and place them in the iron pots. They added snow for water, and then they boiled it. They boiled it for hours. They boiled it for days. They boiled it until the structure of the skin began to break down, turning the water into a thick, gelatinous grey sludge. They called it glue. It wasn't soup. It was literally glue, the same substance used to bind wood together. It was sticky, repulsive, and almost completely devoid of nutrition. Imagine the scene in the Murphy cabin. It is dark. The fire is smoking. The children are sitting on the floor, wrapped in rotting blankets, and in the center of the room, a pot is bubbling with a grey, hairy slime. The taste was vile. It tasted of rot and smoke. To get it down, the children would have to hold their noses. It would stick to the roof of the mouth, coating the throat, triggering the gag reflex. But they forced it down. It was something warm in the belly. It was something to trick the stomach into thinking it was full. But the stomach is not easily fooled. The physiological effects of this diet were devastating. The glue provided almost no energy, but it required energy to digest. The bodies of the survivors began to cannibalize themselves. This is the medical reality of starvation. Once the fat stores are gone, the body turns to the muscles. The biceps shrink. The legs become spindles. The heart, which is a muscle, begins to weaken and slow down. The survivors entered a state of hibernation. They stopped moving. They stopped talking. To stand up was a massive effort. To walk across the room required a mental pep talk. Patrick Breen's diary entries from this period become shorter, more repetitive. He writes about the wind. He writes about the snow. He rarely writes about hope. Snowing fast, wind SE, freezing hard, no wood. In the Reed cabin, the situation was even more dire. They had no cattle to begin with. They had no hides on their roof. They were living in a double cabin with the Graves family, and they had to beg for scraps. Margaret Reed, the wife of the banished James Reed, became a figure of tragic resilience. She had 4 children to keep alive. When the hides ran out, she began to look at the other items in the cabin. She looked at the rugs on the floor. They were old buffalo robes, worn down by years of boots, and dirt. They were infested with vermin. They were matted with mud. She took them up. She cut them into strips. She toasted them in the fire until they were crispy, like pork rinds, and then she boiled them. When the rugs were gone, she looked at the boots, old leather boots, shoelaces, knife scabbards. Anything made of animal skin went into the pot. There is a story of the children fighting over a piece of glue that had fallen into the ashes of the fire. They clawed at it, covering it in soot, desperate for a single morsel of gelatin. But the hunger did more than just wither the body. It warped the mind. Starvation induces a specific kind of madness. It is not a screaming madness. It is an obsessive madness. The survivors began to dream of food, vivid, technicolor dreams of banquets. They would dream of roast turkeys, of flowing wine, of bread, warm, crusty bread. They would wake up chewing. Their jaws would be working in their sleep, grinding their teeth together, trying to eat the air. The disappointment of waking up in the dark, cold cabin, with the taste of phantom food in their mouths, was crushing. The children stopped being children. They didn't play. They didn't laugh. They became small, ancient creatures. Their eyes grew enormous in their wasted faces. They stared at the pot with a predatory intensity. In the Eddy family, the father, William Eddy, was fighting a losing battle. He was a strong man, a hunter. He had a gun, but he had no powder. He had tried to hunt bears, but the bears were hibernating deep under the snow. He tried to hunt rabbits, but he was too weak to walk through the drifts. One day, he managed to shoot a coyote. He and his wife, Eleanor, ate the meat. They gave the rest to their children, but it wasn't enough. Eleanor Eddy was fading. She had an infant son, a baby. Her body, starved of nutrients, stopped producing milk. The baby would latch on, crying, sucking at an empty breast. Eleanor would weep, her tears freezing, on her face, as she held her starving child. She tried to feed the baby a thin gruel made of water and a tiny amount of flour she had hoarded, but the baby needed milk. The glue soup was killing them. It caused terrible intestinal distress. The survivors suffered from agonizing cramps, bloating, and diarrhea, which only accelerated their dehydration. The cabins began to smell of sickness. There was no way to clean the bedding. There was no way to wash the bodies. The lice infestation became severe. The survivors were too weak to pick the lice off their skin. They simply lay there, letting the insects feed on their blood. It was a slow-motion horror, and yet, in the midst of this degradation, there were moments of staggering humanity. At Alder Creek, Tamsin Donner was still nursing her dying husband, George. She had opportunities to leave. She could have tried to join the other camp, but she stayed. She combed his hair. She washed his wounds with snow water. She read to him from the few books they had saved. She fed him the best scraps of the glue soup, denying herself so that he might live another day. But love cannot generate calories. By late December, the silence in the cabins had changed. It was no longer just the silence of the snow. It was the silence of anticipation. They all knew what was coming. They could see it in each other's faces. The cheekbones were protruding like razors. The skin was turning translucent, stretching tight over the skull. The gums were bleeding from scurvy. They looked at the bodies of the dead, the ones who had died of cold or illness in the early weeks, buried in the snowdrifts just outside the cabin doors. They didn't speak of it, not yet. It was the ultimate taboo. It was the line that separated them from the wolves. But as the hunger clawed at their insides, as the cramps bent them double, as the hallucinations of food became more vivid than the reality of the cold, the line began to blur. The hide soup was gone. The rugs were gone. The boots were gone. There was nothing left to boil. The fire was dying, and in the corner of the cabin, the breathing of the weakest members was becoming shallow, rattling in their throats. The survivors sat in the dark, chewing on pieces of wood to trick their stomachs, waiting for the first person to die. They were not yet cannibals, but they were no longer civilized. They were creatures of pure need, suspended in a white void, waiting for permission to survive. And that permission was about to be granted by the Angel of Death. Chapter 8. The Forlorn Hope. By the second week of December, 1846, the logic of the Donner Party had shifted from survival to sacrifice. Inside the buried cabins, the air was thick with the realization that help was not coming. The snow was deepening every day. The supplies were gone. The glue soup was failing to sustain life. The fathers and mothers looked at their wasting children and knew, with a terrifying, mathematical certainty, that if they all stayed, they would all die. Someone had to go. It was a mission born not of hope, but of desperation. They called it the Forlorn Hope. The name itself was a military term, derived from the Dutch Forlorn Hope, meaning lost troop, a suicide squad sent ahead of the main army to clear the way, with the expectation that they would not return. The plan was simple and insane. A small group of the strongest individuals would attempt to walk out of the mountains on foot. They would cross the pass, navigate the unknown canyons of the western slope, and reach Sutter's Fort in California to bring back food. It was a journey of 100 miles through snow that was 20 feet deep. They had no maps. They had no compasses. They had almost no food. But they had one piece of technology, the snowshoe. Franklin Graves, the patriarch of the Graves family, remembered the design from his youth in Vermont. He took the wooden ox bows, the U-shaped, yokes that had pulled their wagons across the plains, and bent them into teardrop shapes. He laced them with strips of rawhide cut from the ox hides. They were heavy, they were clumsy, but they worked. They allowed a human being to float on top of the snow, rather than sinking to their neck. On December 16th, 1846, the team was chosen. There were 15 of them, 10 men and 5 women. The composition of the group tells you everything you need to know about their desperation. These were not just the young bachelors. These were mothers. Sarah Fosdick was there. Mary Graves was there. And most heartbreaking of all, Harriet Pike, the widow of William Pike, who had been shot in the accident weeks earlier, was there. She left her 2 infant children behind with her mother, knowing that if she didn't go, her babies would starve. The goodbyes were quiet. There was no energy for weeping. The 15 strapped on their heavy snowshoes. They took what little food the camp could spare, a sauce, few ounces of dried beef per person, enough for perhaps 6 days of meager rations. They took blankets. They took a hatchet. They climbed the snow ramp out of the buried cabins and stood in the blinding white light of the surface. They turned their faces toward the pass. Behind them, the 66 people remaining in the cabins listened to the crunch of the snowshoes fading away. They knew they might never see them again. The first day was a deceptive victory. The adrenaline of movement, the feeling of doing something, propelled them forward. They made 4 miles, But the Sierra Nevada is not flat. It is a series of ridges and canyons, a landscape that fights you for every inch. The snowshoes were heavy, weighing several pounds each. Every step required lifting the leg high, clearing the snow, and placing it down again. It was exhausting work for healthy men. For starving skeletons, it was torture. By the third day, the sun turned against them. The glare of the sun reflecting off the endless white fields burned their retinas. They developed snow blindness. It is a condition that feels like having hot sand rubbed into your eyes. It is agonizing. Charles Stanton, the hero who had brought the supplies back in October, was the first to fall. He was blind. He stumbled, falling behind the group. He dragged himself forward by feeling the tracks of the others in the snow. On the morning of the 6th day, the food ran out. They had reached the summit. They were on the western slope now, but the terrain was a nightmare of deep gorges and frozen rivers. They were lost. Stanton could go no further. He sat down in the snow, leaning against a dead tree. When the group urged him to get up, to keep moving, he waved them on. "I'm coming soon," he whispered. It was a polite lie. He sat there, smoking his pipe, blind and starving, and let the cold take him. He was the first of the Forlorn Hope to die. The remaining 14 pushed on, but now the weather turned. On Christmas Day, the storm of the century hit. It was a blizzard of ferocious intensity. The wind screamed through the canyons at 70 miles per hour. The temperature dropped to 20 degrees below zero. They were caught in the open. They tried to build a fire, but the wind was too strong. They had no tents. They had only their blankets, which were wet and freezing solid. To survive the night, they did something primal. They created a human mound. They spread their blankets on the snow and sat in a circle, huddled together, shoulder to shoulder. Then they pulled the remaining blankets over their heads, creating a small enclosed tent made of wool and human misery. The snow fell on top of them, burying them alive. Inside the mound it was dark, it was silent, and it was here, in the suffocating darkness of the camp of death, that the mind finally broke. Patrick Dolan, a bachelor and friend of the Breen family, began to go mad. The hypothermia and starvation caused him to hallucinate. He screamed. He tore off his clothes, claiming he was too hot, a phenomenon known as paradoxical undressing, the final stage of freezing to death. He ran out into the blizzard, shouting at the wind. The others dragged him back in, pinning him down until his heart stopped. Then Antonio, one of the Mexican herders, died. Then Uncle Billy Graves, the man who had made the snowshoes, died. 4 bodies lay in the snow. The storm raged for 3 days. Inside the blanket mound, the 10 survivors were trapped with the dead. They were freezing. They were starving. They hadn't eaten in 4 days. They were chewing on the leather straps of their snowshoes. They were hallucinating banquets. The conversation that happened next is the darkest moment of the entire tragedy. Someone, it is debated who, suggested that they draw lots, that they sacrifice one person to save the others. The idea hung in the cold air, to kill a living human being for food. William Eddy, the leader of the group, refused. He said he would fight anyone who tried to kill him. The idea was abandoned. Instead, they looked at the bodies that were already there. Patrick Dolan, Antonio, Uncle Billy, Lemuel Murphy. The taboo against cannibalism is one of the strongest in human nature. It is hardwired into our biology and our culture. But starvation rewires the brain. It shuts down the higher functions of morality and leaves only the reptilian drive to survive. They waited until the storm broke. They crawled out of the snow mound. They tried to light a fire. With the last of their strength, they managed to get a dry pine tree to catch. The flames roared up. The heat hit their frozen faces. And then they turned to the bodies. They made a pact. No one would eat their own family member. The Graves family would not eat Billy Graves. The Murphys would not eat Lemuel. They used the knife. They cut the flesh from the arms and legs of their friends. They roasted it on the ends of sticks over the fire. It is impossible for us, sitting in comfort, to judge the horror of that moment, the weeping, the retching, the turning away of faces as they forced themselves to swallow. But as the protein hit their systems, the energy returned. The fog in their brains cleared slightly. They were no longer starving. They were fed. They dried the remaining meat to carry with them. They marked the stripped bones so they would know who was who, perhaps hoping to bury them later. They strapped their snowshoes back on. The 10 survivors of the Forlorn Hope stood up. They were stronger now. They had food. But they were no longer the same people who had left the cabins 2 weeks ago. They had crossed a line that can never be uncrossed. They carried the weight of the dead in their stomachs and on their backs. They turned west again, walking into the frozen wilderness. They were walking out of the mountains, but they were walking into a nightmare that would follow them for the rest of their lives. The Forlorn Hope had survived the camp of death, but the journey was only half over, and the hunger would come back. Chapter 9. The Red Snow. While the 15 members of the Forlorn Hope were struggling through the canyons of the western slope, freezing and dying in the camp of death, a different kind of silence had descended upon the cabins at the lake. It was the silence of calculation. By mid-January 1847, the 81 people who had been trapped in November were now drastically reduced. The 15 strongest were gone. The weak were dying. And those who remained were suspended in a strange grey purgatory between life and death. The glue soup, the boiled ox hides and rugs, had sustained them for weeks. It was vile, it was painful to digest, but it was organic matter. It kept the stomach distended. It gave the jaw something to do. But by the second week of January, the hides were gone. The roofs had been stripped. The rugs had been boiled. The boots had been eaten. There was nothing left. Inside the Breen cabin, Patrick Breen continued to write in his diary. His entries from this period are terrifyingly mundane. He records the wind direction, he records the cloud cover, and then, almost as an afterthought, he records the deaths. January 1st, 1847. We had a violent windstorm. The snow is very deep. Provisions getting very scant. January 13th. Snowing fast. Wind northwest. Snow higher than the shanty. Mrs. Reed has no hides left. The situation in the Murphy cabin was the epicenter of the horror. This was the cabin built against the large granite boulder. It was dark, damp, and crowded with the remnants of several families, the Murphys, the Eddies, and the Fosters. Mrs. Murphy, a widow, was watching her children die one by one. Her son, Landrum, a strapping young man who had driven the wagons across the plains, wasted away. The hunger attacks the young men first. Their metabolisms burn through their fat stores faster than the women or the children. Landrum hallucinated food. He chewed on a piece of charcoal from the fire, trying to trick his brain. He died on January 31st. But the body was not buried. In November, when the first deaths occurred, the survivors had the strength to dig graves in the snow. They had the decency to wrap the bodies in sheets. They had the humanity to say a prayer. By January, there was no strength. There were no sheets, and God seemed very far away. When a person died in the cabins, they were simply dragged up the snow ramp to the surface and placed on top of the snowbank, just outside the door. The cold preserved them instantly. They froze hard as stone. The survivors knew they were there. Every time they climbed out to gather firewood, they had to step past the bodies of their friends and family. They saw the faces of the dead, preserved in the blue ice, looking up at the sky. For weeks, the taboo held. The taboo against cannibalism is perhaps the deepest law in human psychology. It is written into our DNA. To eat one's own kind is to become a monster. It is the stuff of nightmares and mythology. But starvation changes the chemistry of the brain. As the body consumes its own muscle, the mind detaches. The emotional centers shut down. Empathy evaporates. The world becomes a series of caloric equations. The transition from person to meat did not happen in a single moment of madness. It was a slow, agonizing erosion of norms. It started with the children. The children were crying, not the loud, angry cries of hunger they had made in December, but a low, rhythmic moaning. They were fading. Their eyes were sunken. Their skin was translucent. The mothers, Mrs. Murphy, Mrs. Reed, Mrs. Graves, looked at their dying children. Then they looked at the snowbank outside. The logic was brutal, but it was undeniable. If we do not eat, the children die. The meat is right there. It is already dead. It is just a shell. The first instance at the main camp likely happened in late January or early February. We do not know the exact date because the diaries, perhaps out of shame or perhaps out of fear, become vague on this point, but archaeological evidence and later testimony confirm it. They brought a body down from the snowbank. It is difficult to describe the mechanics of this without turning away, but we must face the reality of what they had to do. They had no butcher tools. They had simple kitchen knives, and perhaps a hatchet. The bodies were frozen solid. They had to be thawed by the fire before they could be cut. Imagine the sensory experience of that cabin, the smell of thawing flesh, the sound of the knife, the absolute crushing silence of the people watching. They made a rule, a law in the midst of lawlessness. No one eats their own kindred. The Murphys would not eat the Murphys. The Graves would not eat the Graves. It was a way to preserve a shred of sanity. It was a way to pretend that this was a transaction, not a desecration. You give me your dead, and I will give you mine. It created a grotesque economy of survival. They labeled the meat. They separated the limbs so that a mother would not accidentally be served the flesh of her own husband. But even with the rule, the act itself was shattering. Milt Elliott was the teamster for the Reed family. He was a loyal, hard-working man who had stayed with the family even after James Reed was banished. He had driven the oxen, he had carried the water, he had built the fires. When Milt died in the Murphy cabin, his death was a blow to the entire group. He was their protector. Days later, Milt Elliott was brought back into the cabin. Mrs. Reed, the wife of the man Milt had served so loyally, had to make a choice. Her children, Virginia, Patty, James Jr., and Thomas, were on the verge of death. She accepted the meat. Virginia Reed, who was 12 years old, later wrote about this time. She said that while the others ate, she could not. She turned her face to the wall and wept. She hid under a blanket. She survived on the few scraps of toasted hide that were left, refusing to touch the strange meat. But the others ate. They roasted the flesh on sticks over the fire. They boiled the bones to make broth, and the effect was immediate. The lethargy lifted. The color returned to their cheeks. The energy to stand, to speak, to cut wood returned. The red snow, as the legends would later call it, had saved them. But it wasn't just happening at the lake. 6 miles away, at Alder Creek, the situation was even more horrific. The Donner families, George and Jacob, were not in cabins. They were in tents. The snow had buried the tents completely. They were living in snow caves, with the canvas acting as a flimsy ceiling. The heat from the fires melted the snow, turning the floor into a swamp of mud and blood. Jacob Donner was the first to die. He was an older man, kind and gentle. He died sitting in his chair, simply closing his eyes. After he was buried in the snow, the hunger set in. The conditions at Alder Creek were more chaotic than at the lake. There was less leadership. There were no walls to separate the families. When the food ran out, the survivors at Alder Creek dug down to the bodies. There is a specific horror to the cannibalism at Alder Creek because of the lack of light. They were living in almost total darkness under the snow. The butchery happened in the shadows. The eating happened in the shadows. Elizabeth Donner, Jacob's wife, watched her children eat the body of their uncle. She watched them regain their strength, and then the supplies of the dead began to run out. This is the phase of the disaster that truly descends into the inferno. The first bodies, the ones who had died of natural causes, were a finite resource. As February dragged on, the survivors began to look at each other differently. They were no longer looking at friends. They were looking at future meals. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal but widely reported, of a man named Wolfinger. He had died earlier in the journey, but his wife was still in the camp. She was small, weak, and defenseless. The survivors didn't kill her. Not directly, but they stopped sharing the warmth. They stopped speaking to her. They waited. It became a waiting game. Who would die next? The strongest members of the camp, the ones who had eaten, began to hoard the meat. The economy of the cabins became ruthless. If you were too weak to cut wood, you didn't get meat. If you didn't get meat, you became too weak to cut wood. It was a death spiral. And amidst this, the psychological dissociation became complete. They stopped using names. They referred to the food as it. They stopped cleaning the cabins. They threw the bones onto the floor. The lice crawled over everything. The smell of the cabins, a mixture of unwashed bodies, gangrene, wood smoke, and boiling meat, was overpowering. Yet, life continued. In the Breen cabin, Patrick Breen kept writing. He sat by the fire, reading his Bible, while his family chewed on the bones of their friends. February 5th, snowed hard all until 12 o'clock. Peggy very uneasy. Peggy was his wife. She was uneasy because she knew what was happening in the other cabins. She knew that civilization had ended. One of the most chilling aspects of the Donner Party is the contrast between the civilized world they came from and the primal world they entered. These were Victorians. They wore bonnets and waistcoats. They read literature. They observed the Sabbath. And yet, here they were, sitting in the dark, engaging in the most taboo act known to man. They justified it as God's will. They told themselves that the body was just a vessel, that the soul had departed. They told themselves that to waste the meat would be a sin, a form of suicide. But the eyes of the children told a different story. The children who survived this period, the ones who ate, would carry the memory of the taste forever. They would carry the memory of sitting by the fire, watching there. A mother cut pieces from a familiar arm. By mid-February, the snow at the campsite was stained. There were trails of blood leading from the snowbanks to the cabin doors. The white purity of the Sierra Nevada was marred by the red evidence of their survival. The wolves and foxes, attracted by the scent, began to circle the camps, but the survivors were too weak to hunt them. In a cruel irony, the humans had become the scavengers, and the animals were the observers. At the lake, a man named Louis Kesseberg lay in his lean-to. He had survived the injury to his foot. He had survived the starvation. He was a hard man, a cruel man by some accounts. As the bodies piled up, Kesseberg began to change. He stopped being repulsed. He began to look at the dead with a possessive eye. He realized that in this new world, the man who controlled the bodies controlled life. He began to hoard. The Red Snow chapter of the Donner Party is not just about eating. It is about the complete disintegration of the human soul. It is about what happens when the veneer of society is stripped away by 20 feet of snow. They had survived the winter, but they had lost themselves. And unknown to them, just over the ridge, a relief party was finally fighting its way through the drifts. 7 men, carrying packs of flour and jerky, were skiing toward the buried cabins. They were coming to save the survivors, but when they arrived, they would not find the people they had left behind. They would find something else. They would find a colony of ghosts, with blood on their chins, living in a graveyard they had turned into a pantry. The rescue was coming, but for many, it was already too late to be saved. Chapter 10. The First Relief. To understand the miracle of February 18th, 1847, you first have to understand the geography of the rescue. We often picture rescue as a singular event. A helicopter descends. A siren wails. The nightmare ends in a flash of lights and blankets. But in the winter of 1847, rescue was not an event. It was a siege. It was a logistical impossibility that required 7 men to do what an entire wagon train could not: defeat the Sierra Nevada. While the families in the cabins were boiling their rugs and contemplating the unthinkable, a small group of men had been fighting their way up the western slope of the mountains. They were not soldiers. They were not mountaineers. They were a motley collection of settlers and immigrants gathered at Sutter's Fort, driven by a mixture of guilt, heroism, and the promise of a daily wage. There were 7 of them. They were known as the First Relief. Their names deserve to be spoken: Aquila Glover, Septimus Moultrie, Joseph Sells, Reeson Tucker, and the Rhodes brothers, John and Daniel. They carried packs weighing 75 pounds each, sacks of flour, dried beef, and cash. They were walking into a death zone. The snow on the western slope was soft and treacherous. The men sank to their waists. They slept on pine boughs laid over the snow, shivering in the sub-zero nights, listening to the wolves that trailed them. As they climbed higher, the air grew thinner. The cold grew sharper. They were burning thousands of calories a day, and they were eating their own supplies just to stay mobile. By the time they reached the summit, the same pass that had blocked the Donner Party 3 months earlier, they were exhausted. They looked down into the valley of Truckee Lake. It was a white wasteland. There were no wagons. There were no cattle. There was no smoke. The valley looked completely abandoned, a pristine bowl of snow under a harsh blue sky. The 7 men stood on the ridge, their breath steaming in the cold air. They feared they were too late. They feared that everyone was dead, buried under the 20 feet of powder that smoothed out the contours of the land. They began to descend. They skied down toward the location where the cabins were supposed to be. The silence was absolute. It wasn't the quiet of a forest. It was the quiet of a graveyard. Then they started shouting. "Hello, is anyone alive?" Their voices echoed off the granite walls, thin and fragile in the vastness. For a long time there was no answer. The snow absorbed the sound. The men exchanged looks. They prepared themselves for the gruesome task of digging out bodies. And then the snow moved. About 100 yards away, the white surface of a snowbank seemed to crumble. A hole appeared, a dark, jagged tear in the perfection of the drift. From this hole, a woman emerged. She was not a woman in any recognizable sense. She was a spectre. Her hair was matted and wild. Her skin was pulled tight over her skull, giving her the appearance of a living mummy. She was wrapped in rags that were black with soot and grease. She clawed her way up the snow steps, blinking in the blinding sunlight, shielding her eyes with a skeletal hand. She looked at the 7 men standing on their skis. She didn't scream. She didn't weep. She simply stared, her mind unable to process the image of healthy, fed men standing in her frozen hell. Her voice, when it came, was a raspy whisper that carried across the ice. It is one of the most famous sentences in the history of the American West. "Are you men from California, or do you come from heaven?" The rescuers broke down. Strong men, hardened by the frontier, wept openly. They unstrapped their packs. They rushed forward. But as they approached the cabins, the smell hit them. It was a physical wall of stench, a cloying, sweet, rotting odor that mixed the smell of gangrene, unwashed bodies, dysentery, and boiled leather. It was the smell of slow death. The rescuers descended into the holes. They climbed down the snow ramps into the buried cabins. What they saw inside would haunt them for the rest of their lives. In the Breen cabin, the air was thick with smoke. The floor was covered in filth. People were lying in bunks too, weak to lift their heads. Their eyes followed the rescuers, huge and luminous in their wasted faces. The rescuers immediately began to distribute food, but they had to be careful. They knew that if they gave a starving person too much food too quickly, the shock would kill them. They handed out small pieces of dried beef and tiny biscuits. The reaction of the survivors was feral. They snatched the food. They chewed frantically. The children cried for more, their hands reaching out like claws. The rescuers had to physically hold them back, acting as wardens of the pantry, denying food to starving children to save their lives. But as the rescuers looked around the cabins, they noticed the other things. They saw the pots by the fire. They saw the glue soup, the grey, gelatinous sludge made from the boiled ox hides. They saw the bones scattered on the floor. In the first relief, the evidence of cannibalism was not yet as overt as it would be for the later parties. The survivors at the lake camp were still clinging to the hides. They were still boiling the rugs. But the rescuers saw the bodies on the snowbanks. They saw the trails of blood. They saw the look in the eyes of the survivors, a look of guilt and desperation that told a story words could not. The rescuers realized they had a problem. There were 7 of them. They had limited food. They could not carry everyone. They had to make a choice. It is a choice that no human being should ever have to make. They had to play God. They announced that they would take the strongest survivors, the ones who could walk. They couldn't carry adults. The snow was too deep. The path was too steep. If an adult couldn't walk on their own, they had to stay. They could carry a few of the smallest children on their backs, but the rest had to walk. This meant splitting families apart. Imagine the scene in the Reed cabin. Margaret Reed, whose husband James had been banished months ago, was told she could go. She was weak, but she could walk. Her daughter Virginia could walk. Her son James Jr. could walk. But her other children, Patty and Thomas, were small. They were frail. The rescuers looked at the children. They looked at the snow. Initially, the plan was to take them all. They bundled the children up. They tied blankets around their legs. But as they prepared to leave, the reality set in. At the Donner tents at Alder Creek, 6 miles away, the situation was even more tragic. The rescuers traveled there and found George Donner dying. He was unable to move, his arm consumed by infection. His wife, Tamsin Donner, was faced with the ultimate impossible choice. She was healthy enough to travel. She was small, but she was wiry and strong. The rescuers told her she could come. She could save herself. She could see her children again, the children she had sent ahead in earlier attempts, or who were going now. But she looked at her husband. George was the man who had given her this life. He was the father of her children. He was dying in a dark, wet hole in the snow, surrounded by filth. If she left, he would die alone. Tamsin Donner looked at the rescuers. She looked at the blue sky that promised salvation, and then she shook her head. "I will not leave him," she said. She chose to stay. She chose to die so that her husband would not be alone in the dark. She took her children, her 3 little girls, Frances, Georgia, and Eliza, and handed them to the rescuers. She dressed them in the warmest clothes she could find. She kissed their faces. She told them to be good. She told them to walk. And then she turned her back on the light and crawled back down into the tent to wait for the end. On February 22nd, 1847, the first relief turned back toward the mountains. They were a strange, pathetic parade. 7 rescuers, followed by 23 refugees. The refugees were a mix of women and children. Margaret Reed was there. Her children were there. The Donner girls were there. They were leaving behind 31 people, 31 souls who watched them leave, knowing that this was likely their last chance. The journey out was a nightmare in reverse. The refugees were incredibly weak. They moved at a snail's pace. They fell in the snow and had to be dragged up. They cried for their mothers who had been left behind. They cried for food. In the middle of the ascent, a tragedy within a tragedy occurred. Patty Reed, just 8 years old, and her little brother Thomas, only 3, began to fail. They couldn't keep up. Their legs were too short for the deep snow. They were dead weight. The rescuers stopped. They looked at their supplies. They looked at the miles left to go. They made a decision. They told Margaret Reed that her 2 youngest children had to go back. They couldn't carry them. If they tried to carry them, the whole group would slow down, and everyone would die. The logic was cold, ironclad, and horrific. Margaret Reed screamed. She threw herself onto the snow. She begged the men to kill her rather than take her children away. She offered to carry them herself, even though she could barely carry her own weight. It was a scene of biblical cruelty, a mother being torn from her children in the middle of a frozen wilderness. Finally, a deal was struck. One of the rescuers, Aquila Glover, was a Mason. James Reed, Margaret's husband, was also a Mason. Margaret looked Glover in the eye. She invoked their Masonic bond. She made him swear on his life and his honor, that he would come back for her children, that he wouldn't let them die. Glover wept. He swore. Patty and Thomas were turned around. They were sent back to the cabins, back to the hell of the Breen Shack, to wait for the next relief party. As the first relief crested the summit and disappeared over the ridge, Patty Reed looked back. She didn't cry. She was an old soul in a child's body, hardened by months of starvation. She looked at her mother, who was being dragged away toward California, and she waved a small frozen hand. "Well, Mother," she said to the wind, "if you never see me again, do the best you can." The first relief had saved 21 people, but the ordeal was not over. For those who were walking out, the journey was a gauntlet of frostbite and exhaustion. For those left behind, including the little Reed children, the clock was resetting. The food the rescuers had left was minimal. It would last a few days, maybe a week, and now the psychological barrier was completely broken. The people in the cabins knew that rescue was possible, but they also knew it was selective. They knew that only the strong were chosen. As the silence returned to Truckee Lake, the survivors looked at each other with a new terrifying understanding. To survive until the next group came, they would have to eat, and with the hides gone and the cattle gone, there was only one source of meat left, the first. Relief had brought hope, but they had also brought the realization that for many, the only way to leave the mountains was to consume the dead. The red snow was about to get redder. Chapter 11. The Last Man. By April 1847, the Sierra Nevada had begun to change. The relentless white storms of winter were finally breaking. The sun, now hanging higher in the sky, beat down on the snowpack with a new intensity. The drifts, which had been 20 feet deep in January, began to recede. The pine trees shook off their heavy coats. The sound of water returned to the mountains, the trickling of meltwater running down the granite faces, pooling in the valleys, and turning the frozen earth into mud. In any other context, this would be a scene of beauty. It was the arrival of spring. It was the return of life. But at Truckee Lake, the melting snow did not reveal flowers. It revealed the dead. To understand the final chapter of the Donner Party, we must understand that the rescue did not happen all at once. It was a staggered, agonizing process. After the first relief left in February with 23 survivors, 2 more relief parties had fought their way into the mountains in March. The second relief, led by the banished James Reed, had taken 17 people. The third relief, led by the desperate fathers William Foster and William Eddy, had taken the remaining children. When the third relief left the mountains in mid-March, they left behind only 5 living people. At Alder Creek, George Donner was too weak to move, dying of infection. Tamsen Donner, his wife, refused to leave him, choosing to sit by his bedside until the end. At the lake cabins, there was Mrs. Graves, who was on the verge of death. There was her son, and there was Louis Kieserberg. Kieserberg had injured his foot months ago. He could not walk. When the third relief offered to take him, he was too weak to stand. He was left behind in the dark, fetid cabin with the bodies of the dead while the rescuers took the children and fled the approaching storm. For weeks, silence descended on the camp. The storms returned, burying the cabins once more. Then came April. A 4th party was organized, but this group was different. They were not fathers looking for their children. They were not husbands looking for their wives. The families were all accounted for, either rescued or dead. This was the 4th relief, but history often calls them the salvage party. They were led by a man named William Fallon, a large, rough frontiersman. Their mission was not primarily to save lives, because no one believed anyone could possibly be alive. Their mission was to recover the property. The Donner families were wealthy. They had carried thousands of dollars in gold coin, expensive silks, and family heirlooms. The survivors in California wanted their inheritance. Fallon and his men were promised a percentage of what they found. They hiked up the pass on hard-crusted snow. It was an easier journey than the previous groups had faced. The weather was mild. When they crested the ridge and looked down into the bowl of the lake, they saw a scene that looked like a battlefield after the armies had left. The snow had melted enough to expose the debris of the camp. There were ox bones scattered everywhere. There were scraps of calico cloth fluttering in the breeze. There were the stumps of trees cut 10 feet above the ground, marking the snow level of the winter. And there were the bodies. During the winter, the bodies had been buried in the snowbanks. Now, as the snow receded, they were emerging. They were in various states of decomposition and dismemberment. The thaw had preserved them, but it had also exposed the gruesome reality of what had sustained the survivors. Fallon and his men rode down to the cabins. They expected silence. They expected to gather the goods, load the packs, and leave this cursed place. But as they approached the Breen cabin, the shanty, that had housed so many, they saw smoke. A thin grey wisp was curling up from the chimney hole. Fallon dismounted. He drew his pistol, unsure of what kind of creature could have survived the last month alone in this graveyard. He walked to the edge of the snow pit and looked down. A head popped up. It was a man, but barely. His hair was long and matted, hanging over his face in greasy tangles. His beard was wild. His clothes were rags, stiff with blood and filth. He looked like a beast that had been living in a cave. It was Louis Kieseberg. He was the last man. Fallon and his men descended into the cabin. If the smell had been bad in February, in April it was unholy. The spring thaw had warmed the interior, and the accumulation of months of sickness, death, and butchery created an atmosphere that made the hardened mountain men gag. Kieseberg was sitting by a small fire. He was incredibly weak, unable to stand without support. But it wasn't Kieseberg's appearance that shocked Fallon. It was what was around him. According to the journals kept by the 4th Relief, the cabin was a slaughterhouse. There were 2 iron kettles on the fire. They were filled with blood. There were pans on the floor containing fresh liver and lungs. And there were no cattle left. Fallon looked at Kieseberg. He looked at the pots, and then he asked the question that would define the rest of Louis Kieseberg's life. Where are the others? Kieseberg stared at them with hollow eyes. He told them that Mrs. Graves had died weeks ago. He told them that her son had died. And Mrs. Donner? Fallon asked. This was the key question. When the 3rd Relief had left weeks earlier, Tamsin Donner was alive. She was healthy. She had stayed behind only to care for her husband. She was a strong, intelligent woman. If Kieseberg was alive, Tamsin should be alive. Kieseberg told them that Tamsin had come to his cabin late one night. He said she was delirious, naked, and freezing. He said she had wandered from Alder Creek after George finally died. He claimed she came to his door, collapsed, and died of exposure that very night. Fallon didn't believe him. Fallon looked around the cabin. He saw bundles of silk. He saw jewelry. He saw gold coins hidden in the cracks of the logs. To Fallon, the scene didn't look like survival. It looked like robbery and murder. He suspected that Tamsin Donner had not died of cold. He suspected that she had arrived at Kieseberg's cabin with the Donner family gold, and that Kieseberg, the man who had once called for James Reed to be hanged, had killed her. Killed her for the money, and then eaten her to survive. The interrogation that followed was brutal. Fallon threatened to hang Kieseberg right there in the cabin if he didn't reveal where the rest of the Donner gold was hidden. He put a rope around Kieseberg's neck. Weak, terrified, and broken, Kieseberg eventually pointed to a spot where he had buried some of the coins. He claimed he was keeping them safe for the Donner children. Fallon claimed he was hoarding them for himself. We will never know the absolute truth of what happened in those final, lonely weeks. Kieseberg was the only witness, and his mind had been shattered by months of isolation and horror. But the evidence in the cabin was damning enough for the men of the 4th Relief. They found skulls in the kettle. They found half-eaten remains that were fresh. They treated Kieseberg not as a survivor, but as a monster. They gathered the gold. They gathered the silks. They packed up the artifacts of the destroyed families. And then they prepared to leave. They told Kieseberg to get up. He said he couldn't walk. He said his foot was ruined. Fallon didn't care. He told Kieseberg that he could walk, or he could stay there and rot. There would be no 5th Relief. This was the end of the line. Kieseberg dragged himself out of the cabin. He crawled over the snow. Before they left, the men of the 4th Relief did one final sweep of the Alder Creek camp, the site of the Donner tents. They found the body of George Donner. He was wrapped in a sheet, buried quickly in the snow, but they never found the body of Tamsin Donner. There was no grave. There was no corpse. There was only the empty tent and the silence of the woods. The implication was clear. Tamsin Donner, the schoolteacher, the mother who had written the letter about the pleasure trip to California, had vanished. Or, as Fallon believed, she had been consumed in the dark cabin by the lake. The journey out was a final act of humiliation for Kieseberg. He was unable to keep up. When he camped with the men, they refused to speak to him. They threw him scraps of food as if he were a dog. They slept with their pistols near their hands, terrified of the man who had survived by eating the dead. On April 25th, 1847, the last member of the Donner Party hobbled into Sutter's Fort. The ordeal was over. Of the 87 people who had entered the Wasatch Mountains the previous summer, only 48 had survived. The Donner Party was no longer a group of people. It was a scar on the American psyche. Louis Kieseberg, the last man, would live for another 48 years. He would eventually open a restaurant in Sacramento, but he would live under a shadow. He was known as the man-eater. Children would throw stones at him in the street. He would die in poverty and obscurity, pleading his innocence until his final breath, swearing that he never killed Tamsen Donner, that he only did what he had to do to survive the God-forsaken winter. Back in the mountains, the snow continued to melt. The cabins, empty now, stood silent in the valley. The bones of the oxen and the humans lay bleaching in the sun. The flowers began to bloom in the meadows where the palace car had once dreamed of driving. The wall of the Sierra Nevada had claimed its toll. The trap had opened, and the few who remained had stumbled out. But as the wind blew through the empty doorframe of the Breen cabin, it whispered the story of what happened when the lights went out. A story not of heroes, but of the terrible, fragile limit of humanity. The horror story in the snow was finished, but the ghosts would never leave the pass. Chapter 12. The Legacy. The snow eventually melted. It is a simple fact of meteorology, but in the context of the Donner Party, it feels like a violation of the natural order. The winter of 1846 to 1847 was so severe, so monolithic, that it seemed it would last forever. But the seasons turned. The sun grew stronger. The 20-foot drifts that had entombed the cabins turned into water, feeding the Truckee River, flowing down into the green valleys of California, where the survivors were now trying to remember how to be human. The physical rescue was over. The 48 survivors were safe. They were warm. They were fed. But the psychological rescue would never come. The aftermath of the Donner Party is not a story of healing. It is a story of ghosts. It is a story of a trauma so profound that it shattered the lives of the people who walked out of the mountains, following them into their marriages, their careers, and their graves. The first thing they had to deal with was the celebrity. Today, we are used to the 24-hour news cycle. We are used to tragedy being turned into entertainment. But the Donner Party was perhaps the first true media sensation of the American frontier. The newspapers in California, the California Star and others, did not treat the survivors with delicacy. They printed the grisly details. They published the diaries. They focused, with a salacious and predatory intensity, on the cannibalism. The survivors were not seen as heroes who had endured the impossible. They were seen as curiosities. They were the man-eaters. They were the people who had violated the ultimate taboo. Imagine being Virginia Reed. You are 13 years old. You have watched your friends die. You have starved until your body began to consume itself. You have watched your mother roast the flesh of your neighbors. And now you are in a schoolhouse in San Jose, and the other children are whispering about you. They are pointing. They are asking if you like the taste. The survivors reacted in different ways. Some, like the Reeds, tried to rebuild their status. James Reed, the man who had been banished, the man who had stabbed John Snyder, eventually became a successful real estate developer in San Jose. He managed to regain his wealth. He even had streets named after him, but he carried the weight of the disaster in his eyes. He rarely spoke of it. Others, like the Donner children, were shattered. George and Tamsen Donner were dead. Jacob and Elizabeth Donner were dead. Their children were orphans in a strange land. They were split up, adopted by different families, scattered across the growing state of California. Some were treated well, others were treated as unpaid labor, Donner orphans, who should be grateful for a roof over their heads. And then there was Louis Kieseberg. If the Donner Party has a villain in the history books, it is Kieseberg, the last man, the man found in the cabin with the kettles of blood. Keseberg survived physically, but his life was a long, slow purgatory. He opened a boarding house and a restaurant in Sacramento, a grim irony that was not lost on the public. People would come to eat at his establishment just to stare at him, to see the monster. He was sued for slander. He was accused of murdering Tamsin Donner for her money. He lived in poverty. His daughters died young, and his wife died. He spent his final years as a destitute, lonely man, begging historians to believe him. In a final heartbreaking interview given shortly before his death, Keseberg said, "I have often been accused of taking the life of Mrs. Donner. I answer this. I am an old man. I am standing on the brink of the grave. I am about to meet my God, and in the presence of my God and the angels, I swear I am innocent." He died alone, a pariah, haunted by the suspicion that he had crossed the line from survival into savagery. But the legacy of the Donner Party is not just in the people. It is in the land. Today, if you drive east on Interstate 80 from San Francisco to Reno, you will pass through the Donner Pass. Millions of cars drive it every year. It is a wide, paved superhighway. You can cross the mountains in 20 minutes, a journey that took the Donner Party months of agony. Most drivers don't even look up from their phones. They listen to podcasts. They eat fast food. They complain about the traffic. But if you pull off the highway at the town of Truckee, you can go to the site. It is now a state park. It is quiet. The pine trees have grown back. The lake is blue and placid, dotted with vacation homes and docks. But near the entrance of the park stands the Pioneer Monument. It is a massive stone pedestal topped by a bronze statue of a pioneer family, a man, a woman, and a child, looking westward, shielding their eyes from the sun. The statue is heroic. It represents the indomitable spirit of the West. But the true horror is not in the bronze figures. It is in the stone base. The pedestal is exactly 22 feet tall. That height was not chosen for aesthetics. It was chosen for accuracy. The top of the stone pedestal marks the depth of the snow during the winter of 1846. When you stand at the bottom and look up, straining your neck to see the feet of the statues, you realize the scale of the trap. You realize that the people in the cabins were living at the bottom of an ocean of white. You realize that when they stepped out of their doors, they were stepping into a void that was taller than a 2-story house. Archaeologists have dug at the site. For years, there was a debate about the cannibalism. Some descendants denied it, calling it sensationalist slander. They wanted to believe their ancestors had died with dignity, but the earth does not lie. In recent years, excavations at the Alder Creek site, where the Donners camped, have found tiny bone fragments. They found bones that had been boiled. They found bones that had been chopped with knives. But curiously, they found very few human bones. This absence tells its own story. It suggests that even in their darkest moments, the survivors were careful. They did not just tear at the bodies like animals. They processed them. They boiled them until they dissolved. Or perhaps they buried the remains deep in the forest, hiding the evidence of their shame from God and from the future. One of the most poignant artifacts found was not a bone, but a doll. It belonged to Patty Reed. It was a tiny wooden doll, no bigger than a finger. Patty had carried it in her pocket through the salt desert, through the banishment of her father, through the starvation, and through the rescue. When the rescuers told her to leave her little brother behind, she held that doll. When she walked out of the mountains, leaving a trail of blood in the snow, she held that doll. The doll is still there, in the museum. It is a silent witness. It has glass eyes that saw things no child should ever see. The story of the Donner Party haunts us because it is a mirror. We like to think of ourselves as civilized. We like to think that we are governed by morality, by laws, and by high ideals. We build our cities. We write our constitutions. We have our table manners. But the Donner Party proves that civilization is a very thin coat of paint. It proves that we are all biological machines. It proves that if you take away the heat, and if you take away the calories, the paint strips away. The morality evaporates, the laws dissolve. Underneath the suits and the ties and the polite conversation, there is a primal animal that wants to live, and that animal will do anything, absolutely anything, to survive. The people who ate the dead were not monsters. They were fathers. They were mothers. They were Methodists and Catholics. They were wealthy aristocrats and poor immigrants. They were us. The haunting question of the Donner Party is not, how could they do that? The question is, how long would it take for you to do that? Is it 3 weeks, 4 weeks, when your children are crying, when the cold is stopping your heart? As you sit here in the warmth of your room, you say never. You say, I would rather die. But you have never been that hungry. You have never stood at the bottom of a 20-foot hole in the snow, with the wind screaming and the fire dying, and the smell of the meat calling to you. The Donner Party is not a horror story about the past. It is a warning about the fragility of the present. The snow is always waiting. The cold is always waiting. And the line between a human being and a savage is much thinner than we dare to admit. They say that in the spring, when the wind comes down off the Donner Pass, it makes a specific sound, a low, whistling moan through the pine needles. Some say it's just the wind. Others say it's the sound of the 87. The Donner Party entered the history books as a tragedy, but they remain as a question mark. They force us to look at the darkness inside our own nature. They remind us that survival is not pretty. It is not romantic. It is ugly, and it is bloody, and it comes at a cost that can never be paid. This has been a deep dive into the winter of 1846. I want to thank you for staying with me through the darkness. These stories are not easy to tell, and they are not easy to hear. But they are important. They remind us of who we are and what we are capable of. If you are new here, and you want to join us for the next descent into the unknown, make sure you are subscribed. We are building an archive of the strange, the dark, and the forgotten. For the next video, we are leaving the ice. We are going to go somewhere much hotter, somewhere where the invisible enemy isn't the cold, but the very air you breathe. Let me know in the comments, do you think Tamsin Donner was murdered? Or did she die of the cold? I'll be down there reading your theories. Until next time, keep the fire burning and watch the snow.